So Charles needs no introduction, but I'll just mention a couple things. It used to be that when I wanted to impress people, I would tell them I was the editor of National Review. A few years ago, I realized if I really want to impress them, what I should tell them is that for about a year, as a 22-year-old, I worked as a research assistant for Charles Krauthammer. That's what people are really impressed by. And I know all of you out there are great fans of the Special Report panel, but there's no way you can beat me and my fandom. When my wife was pregnant, I would turn up the panel extra loud so our baby in utero could hear the panel. So Charles Krauthammer was our baby Einstein, and it worked. You know, like most parents, we think our little one is exceptionally gifted, but I think it's her incredible dry sense of wit came directly from Charles. So Charles, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Happy to be here. Thank you for... there were a lot of things you could have mentioned. That was a very nice way to introduce me. And it was the kindest of introductions, because, you know, kind introductions are where they leave stuff out. No mention of the fact that I was once a speechwriter for Walter Mondale. Very kind. Happy to be. Is this the last event of your?
It's the last event. No pressure, Charles, but you gotta end it for us on a ringing note.
Yes.
So let me ask. You had, as many of us did, some misgivings about Donald Trump as a candidate. So why don't we start in the broadest gauge in considering where we are? What is in your mind, your most realistic, optimistic scenario for how this administration goes, and what's the pessimistic scenario?
Misgivings. On the night he announced, I called him a rodeo clown. I have since repented the rodeo. In fact, on the night he announced, I called him a lot of stuff, including a know-nothing xenophobe. And I think he was actually watching, because he went into one of his famous tweet storms that night, where he was the usual stuff, dummy, overrated, why is he on the air, etc. But his last one was the best. This one was in the middle of the night. I imagine him in his gold-threaded pajamas. And he tweeted, about 3 weeks earlier, my publisher had put my book out in paperback and tweeted out about the event. So Trump tweeted, "Things That Matter" by Charles Krauthammer, now out in paperback. Book sucks. Shortest review I ever got. I was so charmed that I read it on the air the next night. And I told my publisher that when we have another edition of my book, I want to wipe the back cover clean, take off all the blurbs. I want one blurb. The book sucks, Donald J. Trump. My most optimistic assessment is that Trump, the way things are structured now, in fact, I think Rich had it right. We have a populist in the White House, and we have conservatives running the Congress. So my most optimistic scenario is that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, essentially Ryan, no, Mitch is fantastic as an engineer and somebody who gets things done. Paul, of course, is the guy who thinks it all up. I have this image of Bannon writes the speeches, Ryan writes the legislation. That's sort of the division of labor now. That's my most optimistic scenario, that Bannonism remains a rhetorical philosophy, and Ryan is able to enact his legislation, which has been ready in one form or another for 8 years, waiting for a presidential signature. And the most optimistic scenario is that he gets that signature. The test of this rosy scenario will be health care reform, and that'll be the That'll be the canary in the coal mine. If they can get through that without Trump parachuting out of the two-seater plane, that'll be a very good sign. Then we will get stuff done, tax reform. We will get things like school choice down the road. The entire Republican agenda, conservative agenda, has been kind of ready to go like planes stacked up at LaGuardia. Once we get the first one out, Obamacare, again, optimistic scenario, the repeal and replace, then I think we could see a lot of good. The negative scenario is that Obamacare fails. Ryan is undermined, and I think he would be very much unmanned if this does not succeed. And then we get a very unsteady, erratic next 4 years, which will be completely unpredictable. The other part of that is foreign policy crises. That's the great danger. On domestic policy, Trump appears to have a lot of guardrails on either side to guide him and to make things conservative and appealing to people like Rich and me. On foreign policy, he's a complete wild card. There's no time for others to come in. There's no real role for Congress. And there we are in completely uncharted waters.
So let's stick with healthcare for a moment. Let's say you're Speaker Ryan for a day. You have the conservatives think the bill isn't deregulatory enough. You have the moderates who think it doesn't cover enough people. And you have this president who's in the two-seat plane with a parachute somewhere there, we know.
And Ryan doesn't have one.
Correct. So what do you do?
I think the way to handle this, Ryan for a day, that's a real. You could have a game show where you Ryan for a day, and then the loser becomes Ryan for a day. I think he was asked early in the administration how he felt, and he has this fantastic, the boyish optimism, and he said, "I'm living the dream," and then he stopped and said, "But it's not my dream."
Did you really say that?
I read it in a tweet from Donald Trump. So if not, I'll retract and then I'll just attribute it to myself. I think the way to handle this is you've got to hand the conservative problem over to Trump, and you got to deal with the liberal problem, the centrist problem, on your own. There's no way to satisfy the Freedom Caucus, and I think they're whistling in the dark if they think that we can roll back some of the pieces of Obamacare, and they're really ideological expectations of Obamacare that people have gotten used to. As I wrote in my column this morning, nobody out there is going to campaign on restoring a system in which you can lose your coverage with a pre-existing condition. That's a new entitlement. That's accepted. That's done. That's the great genius of the left. They ratchet things to the left. They expand the entitlement state. And you can't roll these things back. I even think the Medicare reforms are going to be fairly radical. But what you got to do is you got to unleash Trump on these people and basically hope that we'll see art of the deal skills come into play. And he has one overriding argument. You cannot vote this down. If you do, the entire presidency is undermined, and the entire agenda that follows, meaning tax cuts, tax reform, etc., is jeopardized. It would really unman, the same way that Clinton was unmanned by the crash and burn of Hillary Care and by the BTU tax he wanted to impose. You lose these big items early on in the presidency when you have the wind at your back and the mandate of heaven, and that gets destroyed very quickly. So his case is you're going to destroy this presidency and everything you want will go away with it. I think that's an appeal that's very hard to resist. They may decide there are 19 of their members of the Freedom Caucus who need to vote against it for show, for primary reasons. So you call them out and you make sure the others vote for it. As for the people, particularly in the Senate, who are going to resist because it's too draconian, there I think you're going to have to let them amend the bill, and then you get to conference and pray. It's about the best you can do at that point. Because I do think they're going to have to weaken rather than strengthen some of the provisions in order to get it through. You already have 4 senators who've declared they will vote against it. 4 Republicans. That's all you need to kill it. You got to win at least 2 of them back, and you got to make sure you don't lose anybody else. So you're threading the needle here. I think, by the way, it can be done. If I had to bet, I would take a 55% to 45% bet. But then again, I bet against Trump for a year and a half.
We all remember the candidate casino very well, Charles.
I lost my shirt at the candidate. However, I won some of it back because I never put a penny on Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, it just seems if Trump really stays dug in on this and really wants to help it get over the top, I mean, he has the ultimate hammer in Republican politics, which is that Twitter feed, which is a Republican congressman or a Republican senator who's one of the last holdouts getting a nickname. You know, it's one thing to be Rand Paul and kind of running around now and making the case against the bill. It's another thing if you get a nickname. And that's where I think he could be very persuasive.
Randy Paul?
We can't do this, Charles. Only Trump can come up with the nicknames. It's a unique skill.
He needs people to help him with suggestions. Yeah, but that's the nuclear option. When the president has to publicly threaten members of his own party, then you've gone pretty far. It would be nice to be able to do this behind closed doors. Maybe you send around a guy or 2 to knock on his door at night. You know, beautiful family you've got here. The way they do it in Manhattan real estate. You know?
So foreign policy, you mentioned that's one of the risks here is foreign policy crises. But one thing I've been really struck by is, given where he was in the campaign, where he was saying things about NATO, if you took literally, and a president of the United States said them, they would be incredibly dangerous, and likely to cause a war. But it just seems his policy, especially on NATO and Russia, has been normalized incredibly quickly.
Yes, I think you don't even have to go back to the campaign. I mean, the single most important speech a president gives early on is the inaugural address. The inaugural address on foreign policy was hair-raising. It was a total repudiation of 70 years of American foreign policy, liberal, conservative, Democratic, and Republican, since the Truman Doctrine. It said stuff that was truly astonishing if you took it seriously. There were lines in there like, we defend the borders of others but not our own. Then he says we build up the defenses of others and not our own. And then the most astonishing sentence, which was, we have something like, we have ripped out the wealth of the middle class and distributed it to foreigners. I mean, that sort of undermines the entire idea that our alliances and our aid were both intended not as acts of philanthropy, but enlightened self-interest, which they were. The Marshall Plan wasn't a happy giveaway to lovely Frenchmen, of which there are very few. It was a very wise investment of relatively small sums, relative to what it would have cost us to garrison an entire continent against the Red Army. Same with our alliances in Europe. So you get this complete overturning of the very idea, the foundation of the West as understood for 70 years and of our leadership of it. And it really was scary. Now it turns out that that's not how they have governed. All the talk about NATO, they've made the right noises. Yes, they've asked the Germans to increase their contribution from 1.2% of GDP. It'll go to 1.6%. They've announced an increase of their military of 20,000. It's pretty ironic, actually, that we should rejoice in the increase of the size of the German army. History has its mysteries and its jokes. So we're getting that. But all the other stuff, you don't see. Now, we get a budget yesterday from the State Department that will cut foreign aid left and right. They know they're not going to get the cuts. So that, I think, was to appease Steve Bannon. I don't know that it's going to have any effect in the real world. The one place where they're really going to screw things up, I think, is Mexico. It takes real ingenuity and drive to turn Mexico into an enemy of the United States, but they may succeed in doing that. But overall, I don't see that playing out. I think it's because Trump is not terribly interested in foreign policy, and he's very happy to contract it out to his generals, and that's where I think it'll be dealt with. The one problem is the unforeseen middle-of-the-night crisis, the 3 a.m. phone call. I just hope they let him sleep through it. I hope nobody is tweeting this. I've got enough trouble as it is.
I feel another Donald Trump book review of your works coming. So the travel ban, it was the initial version struck down from a judge in Washington State on tenuous grounds. Now we're moving further west, and the latest version has been struck down by a judge in Hawaii on even more tenuous grounds. Eventually we'll get to the American Samoas or something, but if you're the Trump administration, do you fight this out in the courts? Do you beat a strategic retreat, or what do you do?
Well, I don't think you can beat a strategic retreat. The reason is the policy is abominable and silly. It's a 120-day ban. And the reason supposedly for the ban is so that we have time to tighten the vetting. Well, you can tighten the vetting without a ban. You don't have any of these problems. Does anybody imagine? Remember when they did the first order? They said we had to have the ban. We had to institute it immediately. We had to stop people in midair from coming in because there was a lot of bad hombres out there. How many hombres are there in Yemen? I don't think there are. Who were just waiting to get on airplanes to slit our throats. And it turned out the ban was lifted by court order. And I haven't seen a single Yemeni bad hombre come into America since. The whole premise is ridiculous. You want to tighten the vetting? Tighten it. So if it were just a question of policy, I would drop it and leave the room. But now we have a judicial challenge and a question of presidential powers. So what's at stake is not the ban, which is a sideshow. It will have zero effect on national security. But now what's at stake as a result of these stays and the ruling of the Sixth Circuit is presidential prerogatives. And I don't think any administration can allow a judge in Hawaii, and as you say, tomorrow it'll be a Japanese judge, because we're really going to go west, denying the president the obvious right he has to institute these suspensions on his own accord, and to give establishment cause rights to people who don't live in the U.S., never lived in the U.S., aren't citizens, and have no claim on the Constitution is simply absurd. So I think they need, this is now a sideshow. No one's going to notice it. Trump will come out with another tweet next Saturday. Nobody will even remember about the ban. But it has to be fought because they have to prevail in the Supreme Court on the question of presidential powers.
So let's move to the cultural realm. One of the most remarkable events the last couple of weeks was the treatment of Charles Murray our friend, at Middlebury College, where he was not just shut down in the student hall, he was literally chased out of town, and not just Charles, but the liberal professor whose only offense was having the temerity to have a conversation with Charles Murray. So if we downgrade you from Speaker of the House for a day to President of Middlebury College or some similar institution for a day, what do you do, assuming you have the interest in doing it, what do you do to protect free speech on campus?
Now you're getting very cruel. I think you have to be very, if I were, of course I'm not, and these administrations are spineless, you have to be very severe with the ones involved. If they're students, they have to be expelled. Suspension will not do. I mean, somebody pointed out, probably National Review Online, because that's where I plagiarize all of my ideas from. And it is, I don't have to tell you, it's the best blog anywhere on the net. So I don't want to
thank you very much.
Flatter you, but yeah, just my Cayman Islands.
That'll be on the back page of my book.
As long as I check my Cayman Islands account. It was mentioned that it's one thing to shut down a speaker to prevent them from speaking. But Murray and the professor were assaulted after he spoke. So if your argument, your crazy left-wing snowflake, I like snowball is better, actually. Snowflake argument is that our ears are so delicate, we have to prevent him from speaking. Well, all right, so you make a case for disruption. You won't be the first to have done that. But the guy had already done it. It was over. This was on the way out. This was meting out physical punishment for heretical views. That's a whole different level of intolerance. So they've got to be expelled. Anybody associated, at least suspended. And I think what they ought to do is to re-invite him with heavy police presence, bring him back to Middlebury, and demonstrate that they're going to allow people like him to speak. And you could actually police it with some of the bad hombres from Yemen.
So I asked Speaker Ryan this question earlier, and I'll ask you the same one. So Donald Trump wins by tearing up the playbook, not just on tactics, but on some conservative and Republican orthodoxies that have been held for 30 years or more. Anything about his success last November that's prompted you to rethink or reformulate your views on anything?
No. Yes, I missed it. I missed the prediction, but I do not repent, other than the word rodeo. I do not repent a single judgment I made about how harmful and his candidacy was to the party and to conservatism, and how dangerous his presidency is to the republic. Now, I do hold out hopes. I do. And the one thing I have to say I've been very encouraged by, people were saying this is a threat to our constitutional system. We already have a loss of trust in our institutions. They've been eroded. Confidence in Congress is somewhere below approval for Saddam Hussein, that kind of thing. But what has encouraged me is how amazingly resilient have been the checks and balances that are there to oppose a president who can sometimes get a little out of control. The Congress has a check and balance. The state's attorneys general, I don't agree with their appeals on the with their argument in the case of the immigration ban, but it's very encouraging that it's a continuation of the Republican state's attorney general who stopped Obama cold in his tracks on his immigration overreaches and constitutional violations. So you've got the courts, you've got attorneys general, you've got public opinion, you've got the media. I mean, they're way crazy, hysterically anti-Trump which I think is really damaging to the media because it's so obvious and almost ridiculous. But nonetheless, they haven't caved in. There's still a lot of resistance. So I'm encouraged by the fact that we have a very strong constitutional structure, 240 years after it was thought up out of whole cloth by the founders, and that I think is a good thing. I still have hope, and then there's one thing. You know, I kind of railed against him for 18 months when he was running. But on the day he's sworn in, he becomes President of the United States. There's no point in rehashing all the things I have said about why he shouldn't be president. He is president. Fact is, he's president for everybody and for years, at least 4. And if you're a patriot, you want the country to succeed. So you necessarily want him to succeed. So every night when I'm on television, I don't go back to my, a priori arguments about what's wrong with the guy. They've been said. They're irrelevant. Right now, I judge him every day on what he does. Some of the things he's done are terrific. Some of the deregulation, some of his appointments, the Gorsuch nomination, and some of the stuff he's done has been horrible. So you just say it. I'm right now in a position of calling balls and strikes, and maybe after a year or two, we'll be in a position to look back retroactively and render judgment. But right now I'm in the mode of your first question, hopeful but apprehensive.
So we're almost out of time, Charles. Let's do a quick Chris Wall-style lightning round on a couple things. Book you've read most recently?
I'm in the middle of a biography of George Washington. I'm impressed by how presidential he was.
Which biography?
I'm actually listening to it. A Wonder of the Age is the subtitle. Don't remember the author's name.
We'll look it up.
But and my next book, I've decided I need a break. The book before that was A History of England from the Tudors to the Stuarts, which can get pretty heavy going. They were also pretty presidential. So I've decided my next book is going to be A History of Dodge City, because I need a break.
Who is the liberal opinion writer you read with the most profit?
The last time I was asked that in a forum like this, my answer was David Brooks. I immediately said, that's a joke. So I want to repeat that, lest I be misunderstood. The answer is no one, although I do really enjoy, and I would recommend the editorial page of the Washington Post. And not just because I work for them, but they have a very interesting take on the world, particularly on foreign policy, where they are hardline human rights people, not realpolitik, in a way that you can't find anywhere else. So they will have the odd editorial on conditions in Burundi, which I always find fascinating.
So, Charles, as a baseball fan, does the pace of the game need to be increased by new rules and or more rigorous enforcement of rules that are currently on the books but ignored?
That sounds like an immigration question. I would build a big, beautiful wall between the dugout
and Fenway, don't they?
Between the dugout and the mound. No manager should ever be allowed to go and chat with the pitcher, or the catcher shouldn't be allowed, or the shortstop. No visits to the mound. They invented signals 140 years ago. Try the signals. If not, tweet to one another. You can see on some things I get really passionate. So that's it.
Charles, thank you so much.
Okay.